We're once again having an interview. We're interviewing Dr. Suzanne Bayley. I'm Mark Brown and my colleague David Tilley. Hi, Suzanne. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
Great.
After 50 years, it seems pretty nice to meet again.
When we met at a Society of Wetland Scientists meeting about 10 or 15 or 20, maybe 25. I don't know. That was the last
I
time.
know, I know. No, of course, we worked together at the University of Florida years ago
Mhm.
after I met HT.
Yeah, so we want to start with where did you get your degrees and how did you meet HT and how did you wind up in Gainesville?
Okay. Well, I got my PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and I had met several of HT's students, and they said, you should come. He is remarkable. And so I actually applied to him for a postdoc and went initially to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill for about 6 months. And then he moved to the University of Florida, and I moved there as well. And that was about 1970, and I remained sort of in his milieu and working with him for about 7 years. First as a postdoc and then as an assistant professor at the University of Florida.
Mm-hmm. And your degree at Johns Hopkins was in ecology or?
Yeah, it was actually an estuarine ecology. And so looking at submerged aquatics, marsh grasses, water quality. So it fit right into what he was actually doing at the time, which is working in wetlands and applying a systems approach to wetlands.
So somebody said he's really incredible. You got to meet him. And what was that like, that first meeting?
Actually, I don't remember. I can't remember what that first meeting was like, but no, I think that I was just so overwhelmed, impressed by his range of ideas, but I don't actually remember it. Mostly what I remember is driving an automobile from Maryland to Florida and getting stopped from the cops from going too slow. So I don't remember HT, but I remember many things later.
Yeah, okay. Well, so you went on to work in wetlands, and you did a lot of wetlands work in Florida. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. And worked initially in one of the early projects was using wetlands to treat sewage. And we set up several experiments in different places. I think you were involved in some of those as well, and showed that wetlands could do it treat sewage very well, provided the loading rates weren't too large. But I guess what was most remarkable was not just looking at, what they would do for treating sewage, wetlands would do for treating sewage, but how to think of wetlands as an entire system associated with their surrounding area, associated with the biogeochemical cycles, associated with the vegetation and the animals. So it was a systems approach right there, even though he actually wasn't really quite as involved as he was, later during my stay in systems ecology.
Well,
so I think the wetlands piece is really important to the the establishment of the ecological engineering field. I would say I think it really the constructed wetland for wastewater treatment, that's the prototypical technology in that field. So what was kind of the thinking back then? Why did it get started? Why was this something that was important at that period? Can you kind of take us through what people were thinking? Were you guys crazy, or what are you doing to these wetlands?
Well, actually, it was interesting because one of the projects we had, I can't remember the name of it right now, was, well, there's this sewage treatment plant that was only doing primary treatment. And they said, HT said to me, well, go out and look at this wetland and measure, what's been happening because it's been receiving sewage for all these years. So we actually drove up to the sewage treatment plant, and it had a tree with a diameter about that big in front of the gate of the plant, so that you knew that nobody had even been in that plant for at least 5 to 10 years. So then we started looking at the wetland, and all it had done in that particular wetland was to increase the primary production. But it had taken up the phosphorus, which was our main concern. And so then we developed other projects, but I think it was because of the fact that eutrophication was a big deal then in the early 70s as globally and in North America. There was a lot of work done on eutrophication. We thought, well, what about wetlands? And so we actually started looking around for sites that had been receiving sewage and then set up experiments as well.
Mm.
Do you happen to remember where that town was? Was it close to Gainesville? Like a
Oh, I can't remember where it was. Keep in mind how I haven't been back to Florida in a long time.
yeah.
So
I think it might have
Understand.
been Waldo. Does that ring a bell?
actually,
Waldo?
I think you're right. I think it was Waldo, actually. And then
Waldo.
I set up another one where also with HT's guidance in Claremont, whereby we actually isolated half-acre plots with sort of a barrier that went down into the wetland and then applied different loading rates of more treated sewage in this case. And I remember that was interesting because we had prisoners from the local jail come out and build it. So it was pretty entertaining. I don't know how long that went on, but that was interesting also because it did take up the sewage quite well. So we were showing how viable this approach was, but in that case, it completely changed the vegetation and reduced all of the sort of rare species and just promoted things like cattails and other species that are much more tolerant of high nutrients.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So those were projects that were going on simultaneous to the Rockefeller Rand project, right? The Cypress Dome project. So these were
That's
ancillary projects that were kind of going along in
right,
parallel.
right.
Yeah.
And I think actually the one at Waldo was
Uh-oh. Oh, we're doing it again.
Yeah. Don't know how to overcome this.
Oh, no.
Uh,
Suzanne and I spoke for about 30, 40 minutes the other day, and we had no problems at all.
yeah, after the time of the day makes a difference. You know, sometimes the middle of the day, just internet
Yeah.
traffic goes way up.
Yeah. Hmm.
Could do I don't know, audio if that helps, but it's not quite as effective.
Yeah.
Could interview each other in these breaks. Uh-oh. Well, I guess we will.
All right, I'll pause it. Let's see. How do I
See if
pause?
she'll come back on.
Zoom recording. Okay. So I forget what we were talking about.
no.
What
I
about
think
wetlands?
we were talking about wetlands, and wetlands at that time was one of HT's big interests because, of course, where he had come from in terms of some of his own work. So, and it was also very important because we were realizing that we had lost hundreds of thousands of wetlands. Eutrophication was a big issue. So we were combining all of that. And there had been no real mapping of wetlands at all in Florida. And I remember a number of us went out and started looking even at the number of types of cypress dome wetlands that we had, much less other types. And so it was very important. It was really exciting time, actually.
Yeah, it sure was. And EPA was putting pressure on municipalities and whatnot to stop discharging into surface waters. And so a lot of them were like, well, what do we do with this sewage? We can't
Right.
discharge surface water. And then that's when, the idea of using these isolated wetlands for water treatment became popular.
Right.
So
And it was popular in Florida and it was being explored in a number of different areas. But I think what was unique about HT was the fact that he was thinking about them in sort of a systems way. So that's what I appreciated as well.
yeah. Any particular moments during that period of time, those 7 years that were you here that stand out as really kind of like typical Odum-esque, things, how he behaved or what he said or whatever.
Well, HT I remember trying to prepare to go for him, and he was essentially a fairly shy person, I thought, and a little bit awkward unless he was talking about things that he was quite interested in. And so I remember every time that I would line up to see him, I would have a list of about 10 things on a list that I would try to get through before his attention and time would run out. And that was pretty standard the whole time. I mean, I did socialize a little bit. I remember I invited him for dinner, he and his wife, his first wife, and that was kind of interesting, but his comfort level was only to talk about systems ecology. And actually, it was interesting because it stimulated my thinking about, what is the future of society? And by this time, of course, he was thinking about the energy basis of man and nature and overpopulation, which everybody was thinking about at that time. So he really, so his conversations about that were amazing, actually, to me, and opened up my mind, and that's probably what's kept with me for the rest of my life, is what he initiated there.
The idea that
I mean,
ecology is bigger than just natural ecosystems and animals and plants. It also always includes humans. Of course, he went big.
Yes, it always includes humans. And so we are not going to solve any of our nature problems without humans, without thinking about human systems. And, why are we such a rich country? Which of course is, at that time, the understanding that fossil fuels was not well known. And in 1974, where we had the oil embargo, that all of a sudden brought it out to the general public. But HT had been talking about that for a long time. And trying to then put the energetics of nature and humans on the same basis, and that was revolutionary to me. He even thought about systems. I remember one time we were driving in a car down to this Claremont wetland that we were doing an experiment on, and he turned to me and I was driving, of course, and
He was a lousy driver.
He was a terrible driver. And he said, aren't the young people worried about sexually transmitted diseases? And I was so taken aback to why he was asking me that. But, I said, well, no, we're not worried about that a bit. And, this was the 70s. Nobody was thinking anything. And I said, well, why do you do it? He says, well, I think it's a real concern, about diseases. And I said, well, I don't know of any. And that was sort of the end of the conversation. But in 1980, 1981, all of a sudden HIV came, and I thought back on that. I said, he was prescient. He thought systems about everything. And the rest of us go blithely along, not even putting things together. But he was quite remarkable.
Yeah, that
makes me think about, wasn't there an epidemiologist that worked with Odum? I don't know if it was in the 70s or the 80s. I met him once. He came to Gainesville. I don't know if it was during your time, if you guys recall.
Yes, I do
No.
recall. I don't recall his name.
I was thinking he might be a good person for us to have a conversation with if we can remember his name.
Yeah.
I mean, HT didn't know what diseases he was thinking of, but he just thought that pandemics and that humans were intimately connected with disease. And, the rest of us could go along living our lives not thinking about anything, but he was already thinking about those issues.
The idea that as populations get more and more dense, one of the control mechanisms, of course, in nature is disease. And if the more compact you are, the more likely there is for transmission of those diseases. Sure.
And the more that we go out into natural areas and interface with them in natural areas with wild animals. And now, of course, we're seeing it with bats and the things that started COVID-19, which we truly don't know. So he was well aware of that, even in the early 70s.
Right. So you said he was somewhat shy. Here you are, a woman in the early 70s, a woman scientist in the early. How many other women were there in the orbit of environmental engineering and the University of Florida?
Well, I can't actually. I don't think he had a few women students at the time, masters or PhD students, I think, at the time, but there were not many. And when I got to be an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Engineering, I was constantly being asked to represent women. Turns out, I think I'm right about this, but there were at that time about 19 departments in the Faculty of Engineering. I was the only woman. And it was very distressing. First off, I'm not an engineer. And secondly, why would I represent them and make them appear as though they were actually welcoming of women when they didn't have any? So I refused to do that. And so there were just not many women, but HT was very fair, very fair. I never perceived anything with respect to him, being discriminating against women in any way, ever, which was unique at that time since I experienced it everywhere else.
So do you remember Thursday afternoon seminars?
No. I'm sorry,
No, it's okay.
I left in 1977, and so I don't remember. What I remember was we did meet and talk about ideas, but that they were a Thursday afternoon seminar. What I mostly remember was the whole group of people, you included, of how dynamic it was. And we felt like we were a community, and HT was the leader of that community. And that was amazing at that time.
Dynamic and diverse, if you remember. I mean, there was people representing anthropology and chemical engineering. There were a huge variety of people that showed up.
Right. And we also, I do remember that we had a number of people from Georgia, from elsewhere, other faculty that were interested in systems engineering from other approaches. I can't remember their names, but it was just so incredibly dynamic. And I don't know that I've ever been involved in quite that scale with that breadth of dealing with things. Although I've spent a lot of years fighting the Alberta oil sands and doing quite a bit of other work, but never where I was trying to actually put nature and humans on the same basis. Mostly, I've spent my time trying to get wetlands recognized and protected.
So you're in Canada. We ought to say that you're in Canada.
I'm in Canada. That's correct.
Have been there since when? When did you move up there?
I moved up to Canada in 1980. So yes, I've been up here quite a long time.
And so tar sands is something very close and very dear.
Yes, and actually it was interesting because I think there had been some net energy analysis of the tar sands, which of course is, I think, the third largest oil capacity, I can't remember, reserves in the world, and yet they are so difficult to actually process and make into fuel that the net energy of them is very low. And I've always felt that we needed somebody who would actually look at that as a real reserve. I think it might have been done, but in the meantime, they are destroying thousands and thousands of hectares of peatlands, which of course retain carbon, and instead they are producing carbon. So I was trying to say, well, how could they restore some of these wetlands around the oil sands, and trying to get them to stop bringing in new mines. I mean, one year we brought in $1 trillion worth. That's how big they were, so it was overwhelming.
And it still is. I mean, they're still.
Oh, they're still going. Yeah. And yet, I think the fact that the net energy of these facilities has gotten so low, I mean, that's one of the major causes of inflation. And since the 1970s and to now, I'm sure you guys have talked about that quite a bit in your other interviews, but no. Well, I can tell you there, they drill down for the surface ones. They drill down. They take off about 100 meters of soil, then they go down into sand, and then they have to, which is mixed with oil, very heavy oil, and then they have to use natural gas to purify that, plus water in a water scarce area, and then they come out with huge amounts of very raw oil, I guess you'd say. But it is very, very expensive for money, expensive for energy. And Alberta is a petro state, which is completely dominated by oil and gas.
Yeah.
Out of Houston mainly.
So the 70s, when you were here, that was the time when there was the Arab oil embargo, and HT became very interested in energy. It was before then, but he testified in front of Congress about, and the key was the concept of net energy, right?
Right, right.
And go ahead.
And it was very interesting because at the same time, one of my other things that I did was to look at with another postdoc, look at the net energy of different transportation systems, barges, rails, I remember. And so we actually went up to testify as well. And we decided, well, we were going to take a train. So we took a train from Florida. We should have flown. The net energy might have been less, but it was very, very inconvenient. You had to take a train from Florida to Washington to talk to the EPA and others about the net energy of transportation systems. So he and I were heavily involved in that as well, as probably you as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was exciting.
Yeah, and really exciting time because the economy took a dive, and he predicted that would happen if the oil was turned off and people were, oh, the economy's dying. And he, basically said, well, the economy runs on energy and not on money. It was
I know. And I think what's interesting is that people still don't realize that very well, that the economy runs on energy. They still think it runs on money, and they how can we actually have an ever-growing society? And I think that's another idea that HT said. We cannot have 200, 300, 500 years of nothing but ever-increasing growth. And one, because of course nature doesn't do it, and two, because Earth will not tolerate it. And now, of course, we're seeing that with many of our various climate crises, wildlife crises, nature crises, every kind of crisis. But that, unfortunately, he did not seem to make much headway in convincing economists that that we will not be forever growing.
no one can.
I know.
Their religion is based on.
He tried, you tried, others tried. I try, when I, was pretty active in terms of Alberta, trying to say, that you cannot always grow, but it just doesn't seem to have reached any level of government.
Yeah.
Wasn't a story about Prosperous Way Down that he had basically the framework in the book pretty much worked out by the early 80s, but it wasn't published until like 2000, 2001 by Colorado Press, I think.
Yes, he did. And he did do that. We did spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But in other words, to have ostensibly a steady state economic system where some companies would grow, but then other companies would fail. And of course, we have that, but but we still also have, we always want to grow 2 to 4% a year. China, of course, 7 to 10. And how long is that feasible? We know that it isn't feasible unless you provide subsidies from other areas that actually that support that, enable that growth. And that's what nature has been doing. The earth has been doing. But how long is that going to go on?
Yeah, for sure. So you now are involved in ecological engineering.
Right, yeah.
You were telling me the other day about your idea of trying to preserve the watersheds and so forth in Alberta. Tell us.
Well, I've worked in shallow lakes, I've worked in wetlands, I've actually worked in wildlife and streams, been pretty diverse, not as diverse as HT, however. So we're facing a big drought here in the West of both US and Canada. And one of the issues that we're facing is wildfire, loss of water, loss of wetlands. And so one of the ways to keep wetlands is to actually retain water behind beaver dams. And in many cases, we've lost the beaver for a variety of reasons. And so it's up here, we're trying to use sort of ecological engineering approaches to build beaver dams, and they call them beaver, there's many names, but one of is beaver dam analogs. So beavers don't do them, we do them, but, and we hope beavers actually would come in. But, and they're doing them actually in the North American West as well to recover streams that have been deeply incised. We're up here in Canada, we're doing it less because of deeply incised streams. We're doing it more to just keep water back on the landscape. The streams actually have not incised, 5 or 10 meters like they have in the US. Up here, we just don't have the water. So beaver dams. So you go out and you build a beaver dam that might be 5 or 10 feet wide, and it keeps water back. And if we can do many of them, I think it'll help preserve our wetlands.
Yeah, and so that's just directly related to HT's ideas of ecological engineering. I mean, he was really big on the fact that we ought to use analogs of nature in order to do the engineering works of humans. Cool.
And not only there, I mean, actually, I think that idea has spread quite broadly. Because not only are we thinking them in terms of beaver dams, we're thinking of other approaches that we're doing to maintain and store and allocate water much more upon a natural phenomenon, where water would spread out and not be all dammed up in massive big dams. So we're thinking about it in many different ways. We want more what now they're calling soft engineering, as opposed to ecological engineering. But it's become quite widespread, and I think he probably helped influence that.
Yeah, for sure.
I think here in Maryland, I've been here for like 20 years, so I've seen some ecological changes, and one is I've always been amazed while the wildlife changes around here, like what wild urban animal is making a comeback. And it was the beaver. About 10 or 15 years ago, it was really the beavers. You started seeing a lot of beaver dams pop into a lot of actually restoration sites we were working on around the DC area. But it seemed like it's kind of tailored off, so I think it's just there's some natural cycle to them as well. But it's a big change here, for a while.
Well, of course, in all of North America, beaver were pretty much extirpated because of the pelts that they were used in the fur trade, and many areas had hardly any beavers. And then people would go and start putting them back, but then they realized, one, they just eat trees, destroy trees, and two, they flood roads and facilities farms that people don't like to have flooded. So the big thing is that actually there's a huge destruction of beavers still. The millions of beaver that there were before, white people developed the landscape were probably in the hundreds of millions, and now there's just millions. But Manitoba, one province in Canada, has now over 1 million beavers come back, and that's a big problem. So what we're trying to say is, I have a paper actually where I showed the value of beaver in mitigating climate change, and so we compared beaver from 50s to 2000, where there were no beaver in the landscape, and then beaver came in. But during drought, there was 60% more water on the landscape with beaver than there were without. So these can be huge in mitigating climate change in dry areas. So they're very important.
So a real principle of just keeping the water on the landscape has a huge effect on the local atmospheric microclimate.
And on water for wildlife as well. And I mean, you live in a far more urban area than much of the North American West, and beavers keep water back, and so mitigate floods, There's a whole bunch of papers now about them mitigating wildfire, especially down in Colorado and areas. You put in a beaver dam, and that beavers then spread the water out over a large area. And so instead of something that's maybe 5 feet wide, it all becomes a half a mile wide in a lot of valleys. So that's what and then when wildfire comes up to that, it stops. So they're finding it critical for retaining water, mitigating floods, mitigating climate change, incredibly valuable. So if people don't want to kill the beaver, then we are having these beaver, I forget what they call them, beaver master sort of thing, whereby you put a pipe extending out from the dam that they have, that you say a road, and it makes it such that they can't block it, so it doesn't wipe out the road. And so these are widely used now, and I think they should be used in your area as well, because all of a sudden not causing floods, and they can't block these things because of the nature of how they're built.
Right.
So anyhow, I think that's one animal that we're going to start to appreciate more, given drought, flood, and fire.
Well, I think that's one thing. I mean, I remember from a lot of conversations with HT and just the ability of the wetlands to maintain the hydrology of the entire landscape. It's not just the wetland themselves, but the humidity in Florida, especially in the microclimate that it created. And he was always so big on the pond cypress being one of the mechanisms for preserving water in the wetlands, just the way they behaved and their transpiration.
Right. Yeah, well, that's, I mean, definitely their atmospheric influences is critical, but also, there are many different types of wetlands, and restoring groundwater is another major benefit that wetlands do. So they have multiple, biogeochemical, atmospheric, and benefits that are useful to humans directly as well as indirectly.
Yeah, still very underappreciated by most, unfortunately.
Well, actually, I think that when I got my degree, first off, nobody knew what the environment was because it was right around Earth Day, and nobody appreciated wetlands at all. But I think in recent decades, people do appreciate them, but the legislative, I guess you would say the legislative control regulations on them are not, they don't protect them. For example, isolated wetlands are not any longer protected, I think, in the US. And none of them are protected up in Canada, just so you know. So if you spend quite a bit of time trying to say what the benefits are, and it's hard to get it from sort of general people. Oh, I love birds, I love wetlands, but to actually protect them, to compensate for them, that's been a lot harder.
I traveled with Jacques Cousteau for a while, and his thing was people protect what they love.
Right.
And so his whole thing was just to make the ocean and the reefs and the animals and so forth something that people could love. And he figured that way, there would be some protection. And I think what you just said is exactly it. When people feel a connection to something, whether it's birds or whether it's wetlands, they tend to then want to help protect it in some way.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. So I think that many of the bigger wetlands that are, like the Everglades and, restoring many other things in Florida, I think a lot of those are now valued for the benefits that people can see. But, wetlands that are not connected, so-called isolated wetlands, even peatlands, all of a sudden peatlands are important because of the fact that peat is actually carbon and it's stored. Then they say, oh yes, but people don't love peatlands the way they love marshes or wetlands that they can value for birds or fish or lumber or something like that. So we do need to show better the benefits. I'm working on it.
Yeah, good.
In fact, I am. Yeah. I'm still working. In fact, trying to protect the Columbia wetlands, which is the headwaters of the Columbia River. In the 2000.
Thank you very much. I said, thank you very
yes.
much, by the way.
Yes, well, we'll see if I have any impact, but it's the Columbia River is 2,000 kilometers long, and the first 180 kilometers of it, now, in other words, 100 miles more or less, doesn't have any dams on it. Every single other bit of it is dammed up. And
Yeah.
so we're trying to say, well, what does that benefit? And it's a huge migratory pathway, it provides irrigation and drinking water, and of course, then all the ecological benefits as well. I mean, I see wolf tracks outside of my house. I see there are elk that I can see through my window, that graze out on the wetlands. It's a phenomenal place. Huge bird populations coming through. So I'm working, now that I'm retired, I'm now working on a small scale, trying to protect that.
Well, it's small to you, but it's also the headwaters of the Columbia River, which is,
It is.
incredible and
Yeah.
very important, downstream, and does a lot of work for humanity down there. So
Yes.
any stories about
Canada should go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. By
I
all
was just
means.
saying 60% of the water that comes into the Columbia River in the US, 60% of the water comes from Canada and then goes into the US. And yet we're now developing a Columbia River Treaty on its 50-year anniversary. And one of the things that they didn't do when they were developing the treaty, more or less 50 years ago, was to think about nature at all. And now nature and the wetlands and the forests and everything that's associated with that is now all of a sudden critically important. So we'll see what that trade-off is going to be. Are we able to actually not have 50-foot drawdowns on reservoirs, which destroys all of nature? Or are we going to try to mitigate some of that? So it's interesting. So a lot of the wetland work that we do and other people do is going into that development of that treaty to try to say, well, if you want to keep willows and other marsh grasses there, you cannot flood it 50 feet deep and then drain it 50 feet dry. So we'll see.
Yeah. So any other stories about HT and his perspective on things from the old days? I know we should have done this 30 years ago when our minds were still kind of intact. Our memories are kind of intact.
Well, I spent most of my career, as a professor at the University of Alberta. So I dealt with everything in the North. And I think mainly he had a lifelong impact on me because of his way of thinking. And he said those things often, so it wasn't that he didn't, that he had an idea and let it go. The idea of overpopulation, the idea of the value of nature, the idea of quantifying nature. And I think now we try to quantify a lot more. So those are the things that I remember from him. And of course, net energy.
Yeah. But the systems perspective, thinking of things as systems rather than as isolated organisms. Whatnot. Yeah.
Well, totally. When I came up, people would look at auto ecology. They would look at, the marsh grasses right here, or they would look at the water quality right there. There's something else right over there. And his work and the influence regionally means that people look at it system wide. And I think that is one of his most important impacts.
Did you have the opportunity to stay in touch with him over the years, or in any kind of capacity?
Not really. He did. I didn't try. I came to after leaving Florida, I went briefly to Louisiana State and was head of the coastal ecology lab there. And then I met my husband and moved to Canada at a place called the Experimental Lakes Area, which is a big research institution to look at lakes. And so I started right away looking at eutrophication and acid rain on wetlands instantly. And it was a real struggle, actually, to leave the group of people that, our whole community that we had in Florida and in the Southeast US, and completely start over in the new country. And it took a little while. but you know, we're very adaptable. I also ended up getting 80 sled dogs so that I could tolerate winter in Canada. So
Wait, how many sled dogs?
80.
80. So you're a
Yeah.
professional then.
Oh, I often teased my husband. I'd say we would have been really successful if, you know, we didn't have two careers, that is sled dog racing and science and professor. But anyhow, we did okay.
But you had
Wow.
dogs, right?
yeah.
You were into racing them as well,
Oh,
right?
we raced. I won lots of money, I've got boxes and boxes of trophies. Yeah. So I didn't actually maintain too much contact with HT. And you know, it was also pretty expensive, you know, at the time to fly back to Southeast US.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And internet, if you remember, didn't come in until later.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
90s
we
thing.
always think we can do things like this, but you know, when you were writing letters, you know,
Right.
or
Yeah.
phone calls, so
Stamps, phone calls,
stamps,
rotary dial. Yeah.
right? Yeah,
We
no,
we had a hard time finding a stamp the other day in our house. It took us a while, but we finally found one.
I know. I mean, and when I first went to this research camp, Experimental Lakes area, which is, you know, now over 50 years and has been doing climate monitoring weather and climate and the impacts on lakes for 50 years, we didn't have anything but a radio. We had no telephones. We had to use just radios like, you know, airlines had to do to communicate with the outside world, you know. So things have changed. We can now more readily maintain contact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, nowadays it's hard to go even like a few hours without my smartphone in my pocket, I feel like, you know.
I'm not as addicted.
Oh, I'm addicted. It's there, just
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
students.
Well, I think that one of the things I do remember walking around with HT out in the wetlands and how he was interested in, actually, I remember trampling through some of these wetlands, and he was interested in every little thing. His attention was not diverted when he was out in nature, you know. He was quite focused, thinking back now. And I have some pictures of him somewhere unscanned, you know, walking out in wetlands and just being avidly interested in every little thing, from practically from zooplankton to, you know, the tops of trees. It was fun.
Yeah.
That'd be nice to see the pictures. We're going to talk to Bill Mitch in a couple of weeks, and he's already sent us a whole bunch of pictures that he has photos from like the Florida years, like in the 70s. And so
Yeah.
it's nice to see
Yeah.
those, because I had never seen those pictures. You know, there's a lot of young faces that I can kind of recognize, but you have to think about
We
who
don't
that.
look the same. That's for sure. So, yeah, I don't know where my picture. I have no idea where my pictures are. You know, moving as much as I have.
Yeah. If you ever run across them, just send.
Right. You know what I did have? It was kind of upsetting. I did have actually huge numbers of of sort of original books or pamphlets that were written by different Art Marshall and a whole bunch of other people. And I threw them all out, most of them. I didn't know what to do with them. You know, yeah, I had a lot of stuff from those early years, but I figured you guys had all those anyhow. So I
Yeah, I'm
didn't
pretty sure we
save
have
them.
in the library at the center.
I'm sure.
So did you do any simulation at all while you were
Oh
here?
yeah, I did. In fact, yeah, it was fun because well, I did one on the Everglades in an early simulation of marsh, peat, air, and it was in a room with an analog computer at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had to wear a coat to do it. And I thought, I am never going to go into modeling if this is what I have to sit here and freeze. This was before, you know, personal computers, and so I did simulate that, and that was published in probably the first issue of, I forget which one. And then I did another one published in the Journal of Electrical Engineering, you know, weird things. So from some of HT's work. So yeah, so I did do some, but you know, having to sit in a big cold room on an analog computer was not.
Right, just didn't make it.
No, not when I could go out and be in the wetlands. And, and actually, that's a lot of issues now, is because everybody wants to work outside and be in nature. And then they spend most of their time in on a computer. And we have that dichotomy, all
Yeah,
of us.
yeah.
Hard to find
So,
that balance.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
once leaving Gainesville, though, no more simulation, right? Or did you?
I'm trying to
Did you
think.
teach it when you were teaching in?
I think I started it, but I ended up just doing mainly ecology,
Yeah.
not doing modeling.
Mhm.
I'm trying to remember. I do have a bunch of papers though. I can't. Honestly, I'm not the kind of person that actually keeps a great track. I know I have around 140 publications somewhere or other, but I don't. I'm not great on keeping track of all that.
That's
Yes.
understandable. I remember talking to
know.
HT one time about the Ecological and General Systems book, and of course the thing is just packed full of ideas. And I'd been reading some chapter, some section, and intensely, and had all this knowledge about it. And I went to him to talk to him about it. He's like, "Yeah, what did I say in that book?
Exactly. Exactly.
Remind me what I wrote."
Yeah, remind me what
and I think that is true for a lot of people, because I mean, that's like when I went to HT, I'd have to say, I'd just start with, what project am I doing? It wasn't, should I analyze it this way or that way? I'd have to tell him, here's the big picture. Now I'm asking you about the little question within it. I'm the same way. I have to be reminded of the whole scale of the thing. So to remember details of that type of thing, unless there's a reason, I
Yeah.
don't think of them.
Yeah.
I do actually have a list of all my publications, and I'm sure you have a list of all of his as well.
Oh, yeah, we have his.
But remembering them, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember being in a system seminar once, and it wasn't his student, but there's another student that had been a long-term PhD student candidate at Florida. And this student had so much detail, and he just kept providing graphs, just detail after detail about this system he was studying. And Dr. Odum got so frustrated with him and just made him stop presenting. He's like, "You don't have the big picture at all." He's like, "What's this all about?" And the guy was,
Exactly.
he just had a hard time explaining what the big picture was.
Yeah.
So
And I think that's very common among all students, actually. So you have to bring them back to what the big picture is, and HT was really good at that.
It was
yeah,
excellent. He was amazing at it. One of the things that, of course, there's the many stories about HT and his transparencies, right?
Oh
When
my
he
God.
was giving a lecture, and everyone accused him of, actually dropping them before the lecture began, so that there was no order at all to them. So,
Right. I don't know how much you want me to go on to some other things, but I went out. It was a major problem because HT was making up a new language, and he was not really fluent in converting other people to his language. And I went out to Stanford, I think, once with another person, and I had to explain it, and I realized I couldn't. I couldn't describe his language adequately. And I think that was, at least in the 70s, that was one of his biggest failings, is to make people understand. He had all these diagrams that he made up for his, and there are other systems people that have their diagrams. And for me, I didn't know them well enough, and they were not widespread enough that they were widely understood. And I realized that if I was going to use them, I needed a better understanding of them, and he needed a better way of being able to explain them and make them more broadly appealing.
yeah.
So that would be probably, my biggest criticism of him from the time that I was there. Whether he overcame that in later decades, I don't know.
No, I don't. I think he took it. He assumed that people would learn the language, and through the course, ecological and general systems course, that would be sufficient. Early on, when he was sort of inventing it, there were many journal articles in teaching, in biological teaching journals, where he was explaining the language and so forth.
Right.
But it's right. I mean, if you look at the literature, you can hardly find one of his diagrams in
Right.
any
Right.
current literature.
I
Of
know.
course,
So,
my-
but that's because he wanted you to learn his language when it was his overall ideas that were so important.
Yeah.
But he wanted you to learn how he thought about it in his way. And at least at that time, I can't say what he did after, but his ideas were so incredibly avant-garde they were so in-depth, they had breadth. I mean, they were just astounding. But requiring other people to learn his language, I think it was where he failed to convert other people to his ideas.
Mhm.
At least that was my impression at the time. I was willing to do it and did, but
Yeah.
going to giving this seminar at Stanford made me think, oh my God, I really don't know it adequately, because
Yeah.
they of course asked me about every interaction function, and
Sure,
I
what
didn't
is
know
that?
it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think what's interesting about the systems diagrams is if you look over the decades of the ones that he created and then other students have created, there's a real evolution and kind of they become less techy, less looking like electrical engineering diagrams and more kind of artistic. Even in Odum's own
Mhm.
style, you look at some of the last ones he did and they're almost, he gets kind of cartoonish to some
Well,
extent on
that's
some of
good.
them.
That's good, because then they're more open to other people understanding them. You
Yeah.
see, so I think that was, if he went there, that is good, because really, if you want to convince people of your ideas, you can't make them learn another language to do it. You have to make them accessible, and
Yeah.
I think
Right.
he did do that because of the large number of students that he turned on, and they all went, to have students of their own.
hmm So did you work with John Day when you were at LSU? Did you guys overlap? Is that
Oh
the
yeah, we did. But we didn't, I mean, I was only in as director of that lab that he was in for 1 year. And then
okay.
I left because I found, I found somebody who would make life more exciting for me than Louisiana State. So,
That's great.
Louisiana is not an easy place for a woman, and
Mm,
not an easy place for someone who feels that fossil fuel development should be not primary.
But
yeah,
then you
kind
went
of.
to Alberta.
I know. Well, I actually moved first to Manitoba and
Oh,
spent 9 years at the Experimental Lakes area, and then we moved to Alberta. But yeah, so we were colleagues there. I was probably more friends with Gene Turner and other people there than
hmm
John, but we certainly knew one another.
Right.
And of course, Charlie Hall was one of the people that introduced me to HT. When because he was at Chapel Hill, and
Oh, so what do you remember how that happened? Or because we talked to Charlie, he had all kinds of great funny stories about meeting HT and
HT,
stuff.
yeah. Uh, I don't really remember, as I said. I mean, he told me about him, but
Uh-huh.
I don't remember any stories about age. I can't even
Gotcha.
remember my first interaction. Sorry.
That's okay. It's a long time ago.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if you had
47 years or
if
so.
you could ask one question now to HT, what would that be?
I guess I would like to know, does he really think whether we can develop a steady state economy?
Yeah.
And how is the world's overpopulation going to be dealing with that? I would like to know how we can solve some of the problems that we are faced now with his approach.
Mm.
That's kind of what I'd like.
He was always the optimist. You never um, saw him get really down about what's going on, but all of his models show society peaking and then declining, and
Right.
the whole pulsing models and everything, where everything goes up and down and up and down. Of course, down is bad, up is good, And yet he never said, oh man, it's going to be really, it was always on the positive side. And that was the basis for Prosperous Way Down, was you've got to
Right.
find a positive way of talking about, things coming down.
Right. But if you're the person whose company is losing because other ones are gaining, and this probably, of course, is less theoretical in systems, but becomes more into sociology. And we have a large portion of our society now that are failing. We see it in our politics.
Yeah.
And is there any answer for that? Well, certainly, allowing billionaires to hog huge amounts of the money and not distributing, and there's nothing that I saw in his system thinking that talked about equity at all. And so if you're going to try to convince people that we can have a steady state society which is not painful, how are we going to do that?
Yeah. Well, there's not a day that goes by, I think, that I have a question that I would love to ask him,
I know. What are some of the things you'd like to ask him?
Well, I'm, let's see. Oh, now you put me on the spot.
I know you put me
I've got
on the
one.
spot
I got
too.
one on top of my mind. I
What's that?
really, well, I've been playing a lot around with like Chat GPT and the whole AI and the large language models the last year, and like they're just incredible. So I would love to, he's got some diagrams in systems ecology where he mapped out how you would diagram the English language. So he was thinking about this stuff, way back. But I'd be curious to see what he thinks about the current models and how they work and what their possibilities are and how they kind of fit into the whole idea of maximum power and self-organization. That's what I was.
That would be very interesting, especially on the fact that I think that Chat GPT is going to eliminate a lot of the early ecologists and early people in almost every career. Because if you can just go and do Chat GPT, you don't need people at that level because they don't have the breadth to understand where that is wrong. We do, because we've been working in systems. But some of the young people that I employ, they have no idea. And that's a big
Yeah.
worry to me.
Yeah, the context of knowledge is really lost in the
Yes.
last 20 years, I'd say.
Yes,
Sure.
exactly. So did you think of one, Mark?
No, not really. Well, they're really detailed. I've been working with a big, large national database, and we have some indices that we calculate, and those are the questions that I would like for him to have him to bounce off my questions about how to calculate some of these indices of national economies and wealth and equality and all those kinds of things. Was when he died, we were just really beginning to look at the global economy as a whole and the various the amount that each nation contributes to that and takes from it, and how all of that is balanced out. So I've been working on a book, and I'm in that section of the book, and it's not almost every day I have a question about those things, and it would just be wonderful to. So what do you think, HT? How do we calculate this? What's it all about? So
I guess the only answer to that is to ask people like yourself and Dave and others who've worked closely with him in recent years to have a better idea.
Well, and I also, when I'm doing that, and I think there isn't anybody that I can ask. I mean, Dave and I could talk, and I think about him and his level of understanding and his level of comprehension of systems and the ability to think there. And he didn't have a lot of people to play with.
No,
there weren't a lot of people that were on the same level that he could say, what about this? So it was always trying to explain himself to people that didn't understand nearly as much as he did. And,
right.
I had Sergio Ujjati, who was, he was very close to the same understanding of systems as I was. So we could throw ideas off of each other and bounce ideas around. But HT didn't have anybody. Like his brother, kind of, but not really, not a whole lot.
No, I remember
think
Gene. I played tennis with Gene, and I didn't feel that Gene had that same
Right.
breadth.
Yeah.
I think you served that role for him, Mark. He loved having you around all
I know.
those years, you know. I
I
saw it.
think
I saw
so.
it for a long time, you know,
Yeah.
witnessed it. He loved
Yeah,
having you
and
there.
that's probably why he kept me around.
Yeah.
I was willing to play in the same sandbox, you know.
But that, I think that point is really good, because all of us want to have people that we can bounce our ideas off of. And so I never achieved that level for systems ecology with HT. Wetlands and more the straight ecology, but the systems ecology, the interaction with humans and the energetics and all those things, no. But I think it's really important for all of us to have people that we can bounce ideas off of. And that's what, you know, so, I mean, does Chat GPT now label us to do that? No, not at all. And, you know, so we need to have people at our own level in our respective fields. And I do feel that, you know, I don't know if he ever felt that that was a gap or not.
Yeah.
Did,
Well,
was he competitive? Did you see, I mean,
no,
in some of these systems ecologists that came, did you ever sense that he was competitive with other people who might have been at his level?
I don't see him as competitive. I saw him lose his patience a lot when, I mean, I remember once when a person I won't name came and had a particular view of systems, and HT just lit in and said, they are not that way. They aren't, systems aren't linear. They're not linear, and you can't make them linear. And they got into this really heavy duty kind of argument. And that particular professor walked out. I mean, he came from another university and he left the meeting because HT just wouldn't accept his way of looking at things. So I wouldn't call it competition. I would call it, you know I'm right and you're wrong. Whatever
Well,
that is.
I mean, to me, that's a little competition.
Okay. Well, I guess maybe he was, but I always saw him as a very gentle and very understanding and willing person to listen to ideas and so forth. But at times, like that particular time, he just lost it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, he was incredibly giving, actually. That's sort of the way I would feel.
To his students.
Yeah, to his students. Yeah. I'm not sure to politicians and people like that, because the gap between his understanding and theirs was so far. I don't know whether he was ever effective in that realm.
Yeah. I remember one time him telling me that he felt bad about his early in his career that he was not willing to, he was too blunt and he was too autocratic. And in meetings and so forth, it was my way or the highway kind of thing. And that he always, where he said that he kind of regretted not being a little bit easier to get along with early in his career, and that later he mellowed. He said, I've mellowed and I'm more willing to, to accept other ideas or so forth. But
I think I think by the time I met him, I mean, he was about 45 when I met him. I was 28. And I think he had mellowed in his personal interactions. But I don't think he ever acquired the capacity to talk with a sociologist or other people who would have been good for him to look at the more social side or the economic side of some of his ideas. But maybe because he was generating ideas so rapidly, in so many areas that, you can only do so much.
yeah, for sure. Anything else you'd like to say?
Not really, but when he was sick, I sent him a letter telling him how much he had meant to me in my career, because it was phenomenal. I guess I'd like to conclude with that. You would hope that every student would have somebody who's so incredibly full of ideas that are very important, that actually takes an interest in you and in developing your career as well. And he did do that.
Yeah, for sure. He inspired an
He
awful
inspired a lot of us.
large number of people, for sure. Okay.
Okay,
Well-
well, that's it.
Suzanne, thank you very much. This has been great. We really appreciate your time and your insights and your stories and whatnot.
I'm not sure I had that much, actually. You know, I mean, John and Charlie, they had probably a lot more. You know, I lived my life and tried to stop the oil sands. That's about it. So, and you can tell since they have $500 million coming in every year, it didn't have much effect. So,
Yeah.
Well, I really
Yeah.
appreciated it, Suzanne. Somebody from that came in the later generations. This is great for us. I think it'd be great for other people too. Younger people to hear your story. So I really appreciate it.
thank you.
All
Okay,
right.
well, okay, bye-bye.
Right.
Bye-bye. Take
Take
care.
care.
We'll see you.
See ya.
I hope.